Welcome to Train Signal. This is the video for Lab 1 of the Building File Servers in Windows 2000 Megalab. In this video, we're going to discuss some of the details you should consider before deploying a file server in Windows 2000. We're then going to examine how to set up and build a folder structure, as well as how to set the proper permissions on this folder structure. Before we get started, we want to take a look at some of the prerequisites and things you should consider before you actually go out and deploy your file server. One of the first things you want to consider is the amount of storage space you're going to need on your file server. And the storage space is really going to be determined by the types of files and also how many users are in your company. Let's start off with the types of files. Now, a typical office that creates Word documents, Microsoft Excel documents, these files are rather small. They don't take up much storage space at all, so you can get away with less overall storage space. Now, files such as large PDF files, graphic arts, even sound bites and sound clips, this video for example, these take up substantially more file space. And if you're creating a lot of these, or if you have several users who are working on these, you're going to need more storage space than a typical Office 2000 or Office XP user. So that's the first thing you want to consider when you're thinking about storage space. Next thing you should look at is planning ahead. Now today, you may only need 10 gigabytes of storage space, but what about next week, next month, or even next year? Take a look at that and make sure you're not underestimating how much storage space you're going to need in the near and long-term future. Next thing to look at as well is budget. If you don't have the money to buy additional storage space, it's not going to do you a lot of good. So consider that as well when you're first considering how many hard drives or how large of hard drives that you're going to purchase. Now, one way I look at this when I'm trying to calculate exactly how much storage space I'm going to need is to multiply the number of users I have by the amount of storage space that I want to allow each individual user. So this can be kind of difficult, but at least it gives you some sort of guidance. Now, you're going to start with, let's say, 100 users. If you had 100 users in your network, then you need to decide how much storage space each user should be allowed. Now, in the lab manual, I specified 1,000 megabytes or 1 gigabyte, which is fairly large. Okay, that's quite a bit of storage space. A lot of users wouldn't need that much. On the other hand, you might have a graphic artist who needs 10 gigabytes of storage space or even more. So you're going to have to tailor this based upon the types of users you have. You're also going to want to take into account any types of files that you want to save on the server yourself. So as an administrator, you might want to save different source files, software, patches, updates, so on and so forth. So take a look at all that information as well. The next thing we're going to look at is hard drive type. Two different hard drive types that we can consider right now, IDE or SCSI. Now IDE is what you see anytime you go to a normal retail store like a Best Buy, CDW. They sell IDE hard drives. And IDE hard drives are typically cheaper, but not as fast as a SCSI hard drive. So when we're building a file server, one of the slowest components of a file server is the disk transfer speed, how fast we write and read from this hard drive. So SCSI hard drives are almost imperative if you want to deploy a file server. In a smaller company, if we're talking 10 or 20 users, you may be able to get away with just normal IDE hard drives and not stress out too much about SCSI. But even in a small company that accesses a file server pretty frequently, you're going to see a substantial increase in the performance of SCSI hard drives. Okay, so SCSI hard drives, faster, more reliable, but definitely more expensive. I would say 2 to 3 times more expensive. Next thing to look at is RAID, or redundant array of independent or inexpensive disks, depending upon where you actually read the acronym from. Now, RAID is a method of providing us fault tolerance. And RAID comes in 2 different basic flavors, either hardware RAID or software RAID. Hardware RAID is independent of Windows 2000. It has nothing to do with it, and it's actually deployed at the hardware level. So for example, if I'm using hardware RAID, this is going to be a hardware device that I install inside my system. It's managed with its own little software program, and it has nothing to do with Windows 2000. Windows 2000 will view a RAID array just as a normal hard drive, so it has no idea that it's even going on. Software RAID is done within Windows 2000 itself. Okay, software RAID, you may have heard of RAID 0, RAID 1, or RAID 5. These are the common RAID arrays that are available within Windows 2000. Now, software RAIDs have a couple advantages, but several more disadvantages that normally make them, not that useful in a production environment. From the standpoint of cost, software RAID is much, more inexpensive or much cheaper. Now, software RAID comes with the actual operating system itself, so you're not paying anything in addition to what you've already paid for the operating system. So that makes it the, RAID of choice for many companies because they just can't afford hardware RAID. Problem with software RAID, though, is it integrates with the operating system and it slows down the actual processing time on your operating system. Okay, hardware RAID works independently of the operating system. It has a dedicated device, it has dedicated memory, okay, and its own hardware card on the actual server itself. So this is managed outside of the operating system. Hardware RAID's more expensive. Hardware RAID's definitely going to be much faster, and it's also going to be a lot more reliable than software RAID. And you're going to find that really any entry-level server now, and I guess I shouldn't say entry-level because entry-level, some of these don't have RAID arrays on them, but even the low-end servers, they're starting to come with RAID arrays built into them. Okay, they're getting fairly inexpensive. You can buy a cheap RAID array or some sort of RAID card for $200-300. Now they definitely get more expensive depending upon the feature sets, okay, that you're looking for, but you can get them relatively inexpensively built right into some of the lower end servers that are offered by Dell or Compaq or some of the other vendors as well. Partitions. Now partitions is something that we want to look at and take a look at closely right from the beginning. And there's two things we really need to consider when it comes down to partitions. Size, okay, how big the partition is going to be, and the number of partitions we want. And this really boils down to organization. Okay, now obviously we're going to be limited by the number of hard drives and the size of these hard drives before anything else. But once we have that figure determined, then we need to decide how we're going to break down these hard drives and partition them out. First thing you need to consider is the system partition. Where are you going to install Windows 2000? Okay, this is where the WinNT folder is going to exist. Now the minimum you'll see in books is a 1 gigabyte, or sometimes you'll see a 2 gigabyte partition as a minimum. This is much too small for a file server though, or any type of server for that matter. You need to put a Windows 2000 server on really at least a 5 gigabyte system partition, and I like to even use a partition that's a little bit larger than that. Okay, now let's talk about why that is. 5 gigabyte partition will definitely hold the Windows 2000 server operating system, Service Pack 2, and also some of the hot fixes and other security checks that you might install. That's going to get you somewhere up around 1.5 or 2 gigabytes of storage space. So right there you're already eclipsing the 1 gigabyte or 2 gigabyte mark that we talked about. You also don't want to get too close to the upper limit on your system partition. Okay, you really don't want to have any more than 75% of the capacity taken up. So, other stuff that we might install in our system partition that we should consider. Program files. Okay, a lot of times if you're installing programs, disk defragmentation, backup programs, any other sort of applications that may be installed, a lot of times these are installed on the system partition as well. So if those are going to be installed in the system partition, you need to keep that in mind. Future service packs. As more and more service packs are released, they're going to get bulkier and bulkier. Okay, so more and more space is going to be needed for those service packs. Also, future releases of Windows 2000 itself. If you upgraded from NT4 to Windows 2000 Server, you saw a substantial increase in the amount of hard drive space needed. For example, you could install NT 4.0 safely on a 2 gigabyte partition. But if you upgrade an NT 4.0 installation to Windows 2000, you're going to be pushing the limits right from the very beginning. Okay, so that's something to consider. Always use more than you think you're going to need without using too much and making it overkill. So I recommend somewhere between 5 and 10 gigabytes for your system partition, depending upon what you think you're going to need and also what your company's budget is. If you can afford to allocate those extra 5 gigabytes out to the system partition, I definitely recommend that you do it. Now when it comes to data, what are we going to do with data? Where are we going to put this? Now you could put it on the system partition as well. There's nothing stopping you from doing that. But what I like to do is organize it. If I want to make a backup of my data partition, it's much simpler to separate it out from the system files. So I could put my data on its very own partition, and then when I want to back it up, I just back up that particular partition, let's say the D drive, instead of the C drive, going through there and specifying which individual files I want to back up. So how big? That really, goes back to what we were talking about before, storage space. This is where we have to start calculating, how much storage space we're going to need. Okay. Now, typically, I'm going to leave some partitions open. Some programs will, need to use their own separate partitions, or you may want to further organize your partition. So I'm going to leave some unallocated space on the actual physical hard drive. So what I'm saying here, let's say that we have a 100 gigabyte hard drive, just to use a round number, and I use 10 gigabytes for my system partition, and I've figured out that I'm going to need about 50 gigabytes for my initial disk usage for all my users. I'm going to go ahead and just create one partition, and I'm going to make it 50 gigabytes in size, or a second partition I should say, that's going to be 50 gigabytes in size. So my net result right now is a 10 gigabyte system partition that'll be C, a 50 gigabyte partition that's going to hold all the data, that's going to be my D drive, and I'm still going to have 40 gigabytes of unallocated space left over. Okay, and this unallocated space can be saved, it can be used in the future, depending upon how we formatted this operating system and whether we have basic or dynamic storage. We can even extend our current partition. So if we're starting to run out of that 50 gigabytes on the data partition, we could extend it and include part of that additional 40 gigabytes within it. Regardless though, it's really not that big of a deal, because I can just simply create another data partition, call it E, put another shared folder there, and continue on right from there. Okay, or I could mount a volume to it. There's a lot of flexibility with it. But what I want to urge you to do is not try to create all your partitions up front. Okay, you never know how your needs are going to change as you're going into the future. Okay, and it's always simpler to keep it as basic as possible. So create your system partition, create your data partition, try to leave some space left over. If you feel like you're already pushing a gamut as far as the amount of disk space available, you may use up the entire physical hard drive. That's fine. You can always add an additional hard drive at a later time. Another thing to consider that we didn't talk about is, what if you're using some sort of RAID? And on a file server, you're most definitely going to be using some sort of RAID, or you should be. Now, you need to consider your disk storage space in conjunction with that. If you have a disk mirror set up, for example, that's only going to take up it's going to take up twice as much as your actual hard drive space. So if you have data that's taking up 50 gigabytes of space and you've mirrored that partition to another location, well, that's an additional 50 gigabytes of space you're going to have to consider. Okay, so you should have at least a little bit of background on mirrors, stripe sets with parity, and the requirements involved in that. But that's another consideration when you're factoring out how much disk space you're going to need. Last thing we're going to talk about is the actual file system that we're going to use within Windows 2000. And the file system is very important. On the system partition itself, in NT 4.0, a lot of times this partition was formatted with the FAT16 file system. And recall that NT 4.0 does not support FAT32, so that wasn't even an option. But FAT16 was often used on this NT 4.0 system partition, so if you had to troubleshoot, you could troubleshoot this partition using a DOS boot disk. Okay, meaning I could boot up with a DOS boot disk, use some DOS commands, access this actual partition to do any sort of troubleshooting, copying files over, renaming files, etc. If you formatted that partition with NTFS, there is no native way of actually getting into that partition. There are some third-party programs out there that would allow you to, but there's no native way of doing it straight through NT 4.0. Windows 2000 has addressed this problem. Okay, they've got a new tool called Recovery Console that allows you to boot up and actually access your NTFS partition from the command line. So if your system fails to boot and you're having issues with it, device driver, service, whatever it might be, brings your system down, you can boot up using a CD-ROM, go into Recovery Console, and then troubleshoot the NTFS partition from a command prompt. Okay, what this means to us, there's really almost no reason to use the FAT16 or FAT32 file system anymore. Okay, you should almost always, for your system partition and your data partition, be using NTFS. And the one exception to this rule would be if you're dual booting a system. Now in a home test lab environment, this may be the case, and you may want to be able to access this partition with another operating system. On a production server, I can't imagine why you'd want to do this. Okay, typically you're only going to have Windows 2000 running on the system. Servers are up 24/7, 365 days a year for the most part, and there's no reason why you'd want to dual boot back and forth between two different operating systems that I can think of. Okay, but if you're dual booting your own system for whatever reason, you've got Windows 95, 98, NT 4.0 on there, well, that would be your only reason why you still might want to run the FAT16 file system, because because all of those operating systems, including 2000, are compatible with that. Okay, next thing we're going to do is just get started and go over and take a look at SRV11 to actually see what we need to do on this system. So let's go connect over to SRV11 using terminal services and take a look at how we can manipulate these disk volumes. So we're going to log on here. We're going to right click on my computer, go to Manage, which will open up the Computer Management Console. Now once we're here, we're going to be utilizing the tool called Disk Management. And within Disk Management here, we're going to take a look at a couple different things we can do. Now first things first, we've got it divided up into two different portions. The top portion just displays information a little bit differently than the bottom portion does. Slide that over here a little bit. First thing I'd like to do is take a look at my drive letters. Currently right now I have one physical hard drive. That's disk 0. So this is the actual piece of metal that's inside your system. Now this is divided up into right now just one partition with free leftover space left on the hard drive. In addition to that, we have a CD-ROM drive, which is marked here as CD-ROM 0, and the CD-ROM drive is referenced with the logical drive letter D. Now I like to change this up and actually make this, I usually make it Z. You can make it anything you want, but Z works for me. It's the last drive letter in the alphabet, and it's easy for me to remember. Now the reason I like to do this is because the next time I create a partition, now it's going to take on the drive letter D, and my partitions then are lettered in order. I've got C, D if I create additional ones, E, F, G. If you have the CD-ROM sitting in the middle there, it can be sometimes confusing. And I like to keep my partitions consistent along with the CD-ROM drive letters consistent amongst all my different servers. So this is a much easier way of managing things, at least for me. Okay, so I've changed that. So we now have the Z drive letter. And the next thing we're going to take a look at is creating a partition. Now when we look at this right now, we have one primary partition. This is where Windows 2000 is installed. Okay, when we right click here and go to create partition, we have a couple different choices. We can create either a primary partition or an extended partition. Now, this is a little bit confusing, but something that's important to remember. Within Windows 2000, on any physical hard drive, okay, and right now we're running basic disks. You may have heard of dynamic disks, but we have a basic disk that has not been upgraded to dynamic. What you can do is create up to 4 partitions. So we've used up one already. That's where Windows 2000 is installed. So we have 3 more partitions to use. Now you can create all primary partitions if you desire, okay, but you're going to be limited to only 4 partitions, or you can create up to 3 primary partitions and 1 extended partition. And the nice thing about an extended partition is that it lets you divide it up even further into what are called logical drives. So the reason you'd want to use an extended partition is if you think you're going to be using more than 4 drive letters, or even if there's a remote possibility that you'll be doing that, you want to use an extended partition. As far as how it ends up, the end result, there's really no difference. They're all going to be just chunks of hard drive space that you can save data to. Okay, for demonstration purposes though, we're going to set up an extended partition and show you how that differs. So I'm selecting extended, I click next, you get to choose the amount of space to use, and we're just going to use the remaining portion of disk space. Your number may vary here, it's really going to depend upon how big your hard drive is. Click finish, and now that we see that we're done here, there is no drive letter. Okay, this is marked as an extended partition. You see kind of the darker green background, and the lighter green is indicating that this is free space on the extended partition. Currently right now we have not assigned a drive letter and we've not formatted this partition, so we cannot write data to it. So our next step before we can write any data to this is to create what's called a logical drive. Okay, so it's just another term. It really is no different, in the end result as it is to create a primary partition. So we're just going to create a logical drive on top of this extended partition. So we're going through another partition wizard here. Our only choice is a logical drive because we started from an extended partition. I'm going to split this one up, show you what the difference is. So we'll create this as a 1500 megabyte logical drive. Here I have the choice of either assigning a drive letter, mounting a volume to a folder, or not assigning a drive letter or path at all. Okay, assigning a drive letter is the traditional way of doing things, and this is the way you'll probably be doing it the majority of the time. Just giving this partition or logical drive a drive letter, and then being able to access this drive through the My Computer icon. Okay, so usually the simplest and the easiest way of doing things. You can also choose to not assign a drive letter or a drive path. So maybe you want to set this logical drive aside and not use it, reserve it for something else. But by not assigning it a drive letter or a path, this drive is not going to be accessible, meaning you're not going to be able to write data to it. Okay, so this is not what you choose if you want to currently use this drive. Our second option here, mount this volume at an empty folder that supports drive paths. Well, this allows us to map this volume, okay, it's actually a logical drive to use the technical term, to map this logical drive, and when we get done here it's going to be chopped in half, 1500 megabytes. Okay, so it allows us to map this to a folder that we create on another volume. Okay, to a folder that we create on another volume. For example, we have our C drive here. I can create a folder on the C drive and mount a volume. Basically, it's the equivalent of saying redirect or point over to this partition. So in sum, any data that's placed inside to this folder here is going to be redirected and actually saved on this D drive that I'm creating right now. Okay, so it's going to be redirected and saved in this D drive that I'm creating right now. Okay, so why? Why do we use mounted volumes? This is a new feature to Windows 2000. Okay, well, the reason we use them are several. One, you might just run out of drive letters. Okay, maybe you've created so many partitions and logical drives that you're to the point now where you're to Z and you'd like to create additional spaces to store information. Well, you can mount a volume to an empty folder and it doesn't require a drive letter. Okay, second reason, if you're running out of disk space on a particular volume, let's say that you have an NTFS volume that's a basic disk and you're running out of disk space on it and you'd like to extend that volume, in effect making it larger. Well, by mounting a volume, you're not truly making that volume larger, but you have the ability to create a folder, okay, that redirects over to this, extra space, and in theory, extending that partition. Okay, and then the last reason, a lot of times people just use this because they're used to it. People that are coming from the Unix world or Novell world, well, they use mounted volumes all the time, and it's something that they've used, ever since they learned and have been systems administrators. So there's three different reasons you might want to mount a volume. Key things to remember. Number one, it has to be an empty folder. Number two, it has to be on an NTFS volume. So for example, if C here was a fat partition for some reason, you would not be able to mount a volume here. So it has to be NTFS, and on this partition there must exist an empty folder. Okay, we're going to opt for the easy, most popular option and assign a drive letter. And the next drive letter in line is D. That'll work fine, so we're going to go ahead and select that. Next we have the choice of not formatting the partition. So once again, that would be creating a partition, setting it aside for later use, because if we do not format it, we can't write data to it. File system to use, FAT32 or NTFS. Remember, 99% of the time you're going to be using the NTFS file system. Allocation unit size. You can change this up if you want to get more detailed with how information is saved to your hard drive. Typically though, default will be the best recommendation for you. Perform a quick format and then enable file and folder compression. If you'd like, right from this wizard you can enable compression on this entire drive, so any information that's saved to it is going to be compressed to actually save disk space. Now a quick format is something you may want to do in this test lab environment, because a quick format is going to take you through and it's going to format the hard drive without checking for bad sectors on the hard drive. Now this is good, like I said, in a test lab environment. On a real server, you're going to want to format the drive. Just go through the long, drawn-out format. Make sure that the drive is okay. Okay, so right now we'll do a quick format just to get through it fairly quickly. Click Next. Confirm all of your choices. Then click on Finish. Okay, so it should just take just a second here since we're doing a quick format. Sometimes you will get an error message here. Something comes up and gives you an error message. I think it comes up about, 50% of the time, I would say. What you need to do is just click OK, right click on the volume that was created, and then just format it manually. Okay, so it would create the partition or create the logical drive, but it wouldn't be formatted. So you'd have to go back in here, right click on it, and then format it. Okay, now you see that we have a D drive, 1.46 gigabytes. It's formatted with the NTFS file system, and it is healthy. So notice, what I really want you to see here is to notice how we have the extended partition, which is that dark green. And within that extended partition, we've created a logical drive. Notice the blue up here corresponds with this. And we still have free space left over, so we can continue to create more logical drives. I could chop these up into 100 megabyte drives if I wanted to and create another 10 logical drives. Okay, so you can do anything you want as far as that's concerned. Notice also that we can refer to both of these different diagrams here. We've got the one up top that shows us the volume letters, the volume labels, what type of partition it is, the type of disk that it exists on, the file system, etc., etc. And you really have this same type of information down below, just represented a little bit differently. Next thing I want to take a look at is labeling these volumes. And the reason we label volumes is to make sure that they're easier to identify. For example, we're going to take this one here, go to the properties of it, and we're going to label this volume as system. Okay, and technically I should really be referring to these as partitions, okay, because we're using a basic disk, and each one of these chunks are partitions, not volumes, so don't be confused by my terms there. But in the real world, I think the terms are pretty much used interchangeably, partitions and volumes. Right now though, since it's a basic disk, partitions, if it was dynamic, they'd be referred to as volumes. Okay, not to get too far off the subject here. So we're going to label this system, and it makes it easier to identify. If somebody else steps up to the server, takes a look at it, they'll have a much better idea of what this particular partition is to be used for. And we're going to want to label this as well. New volume doesn't cut it. So we go to properties, and we're going to call this one data. Okay, and maybe it's programs or administrative data or user data. Whatever's on that physical hard drive or whatever's on that partition is what you can label it. So to keep it simple though, we just have, plain and simple system and data. Okay, the next thing we're going to do, let's start building our actual file server. Okay, and to do this, one of the main jobs you're going to have is creating a folder structure for your users. Now, it's not reasonable to think that your users are going to come up with some organized folder structure and they're going to start building this on their own. So as an administrator, what you need to do is kind of get the ball rolling for them. Okay, and to do that, we're going to go out to our D drive now. So notice that I'm putting all this information, all this data is going to be on its own separate partition. Okay, the reason, much simpler to back up, much simpler to separate out what's system information and what's data. Okay, and we're going to create two main folders. We're going to create a public folder, and we're going to create a software folder. Okay, the main premise here is that all the information that's going to be available to the public users, and that's not people outside of our company, but the users within our company, will be available through here. Underneath the software folder, we're also going to be giving out information or software that can be used by the users within the company. Okay, now to share this information, we're going to have to share these folders. We're going to go ahead and share both of these. And right now, we're going to accept the defaults. We'll come back to explaining these in a second. So you right-click on them, go to Sharing. Sharing tab will come up. Share this folder. Click OK. Now you see hands underneath both of these folders. I'm just refreshing here. And both of these folders are now going to be available on the network. Our next step. Okay, let's talk about what we're doing a little bit here. For Ben and Brady's Ice Cream Company, what we've decided to do is divide our public folder up into some subfolders based upon the actual business groups or business functional groups that we have. So we're going to have a folder for accounting, a folder for marketing, and a folder for sales. In addition, we're going to have a general folder. It's going to be kind of a catch-all. If there's any information that needs to be exchanged between the departments or common information, that'll be stored within the general folder. Now, one additional thing we need to note here. When we create this structure, we don't want our users to modify this structure. For example, I created a public folder and a software folder. This is not where I want users to be able to, rename this or create their own folders. If a user had free reign to a partition or to a folder, a lot of times what happens is they don't bother to organize their own information. Okay, so you could open up this public folder, for example, and if you gave them free reign to the public folder, what would happen is you'd end up having, thousands of files right off the root of this public folder. Okay, not the biggest deal in the world. It's not going to cause you issues, but it's harder for your users to find information. So it's kind of nice to start them off, on the right note and create a little simple structure for them to start with. So what we're going to do is go ahead and do that. So right now we're within the public folder, and we're going to create folders for our different departments that we mentioned. So that's going to include accounting. It's going to include sales, marketing, and we're going to create a general folder. Okay, on the other side here, within software, we're going to have two different folders here. We're going to have admin, and this is going to be reserved for administrative users who need to use administrative tools, antivirus, patches, software, that sort of thing. And we're also going to have a folder for our users. Okay, premise here, users can access this folder. We're going to put common software in here, maybe Adobe Acrobat Reader or other software that users are free to use, distribute, and install on their own. Okay, software fixes, anything we might want to put in there we can share. So we're going to give the users the ability to use this folder. Okay, let's take a look back here now. We're going to focus our attentions a little bit more on this public folder. Now our goal of this particular section is to secure the public folder and our 4 folders here. Okay, and when I say secure, I don't want users to be able to modify, which includes deleting or renaming this folder, and I don't want them to be able to create additional folders at this level here. Okay, now a user who belongs to the accounting group should be able to open up this folder and now should have the ability to do anything they want within this folder. So this is kind of their playground. This is where they can go to create their own folder structure from here on out. So if your accounting users are lazy and they're not so organized, they very well might put all of their information directly underneath this accounting root here. Okay, if that happens, then that's their problem to deal with. You try to getting them started as much as you can. Okay, now they can also create their own folder structure here. They're basically free to do whatever they want. Same thing applies for our marketing and for our sales folder. A user who belongs to a marketing group is going to be able to open up this folder and access the information within the folder. Okay, and they can do anything they want in here once again. So a marketing user can create their own information, delete it, okay, look at other information, whatever it may be. But a marketing user cannot open up the accounting or the sales folder. So both of these folders will be off limits where they can't even read the information. So if I'm a user of marketing trying to open up sales, access will be denied before I even open up that folder. Okay, then we have the general folder. And everybody will be able to access the general folder. So if you log on, and whether or not you're a member of sales, marketing, or accounting, you should be able to access and open that general folder. The administrators will be able to open up any of these folders, of course, and be able to manage this just like they would, the rest of the folders on this file server. Okay, let's go take a look at how this looks within Windows Explorer. I'm going to back up a step here. I'm going to right-click on D and just go to Explore. Okay, now we can take a look at this via a Windows Explorer window. Okay, so this is how your folder structure should look as well. You should see this diagram in your manual, I believe. You've got a public folder. Underneath that, you've got 4 folders: accounting, general, marketing, and sales. You also have a software folder. It is not underneath the public folder. Okay, it's at the root of D, just like public is. So if you open up D, you see public and you see software. If I open up software again, you see admin and users. Okay, let's go talk about permissions. So first thing we'll do, we're going to go to the public folder to start with. And we're going to look at the default permissions of this public folder. So we'll actually back up one step. Go to the properties of the public folder. And let's take a look at what our NTFS permissions are. Okay, NTFS, remember, is found by going to the Security tab. Okay, so we're not going to worry too much about share permissions. We'll talk about that lastly here, but we're going to start off setting these NTFS permissions. Now everyone, full control is the default permission that's assigned. And this is not very secure. Everyone means just what it says, okay? Everybody. It's not just your users in the network, but really anybody. You don't even have to have a user account. Everybody has full control access to this folder and all the subfolders underneath of it. Okay, so this is something we're going to want to eliminate, is get rid of this everyone folder. Okay, to do this, first we want to add the users that should have access. Okay, and the users that we're going to allow access are the authenticated users as well as the local administrators. Okay, so what we're going to do first, we're going to go out to the local machine. And this is usually where I lose people here a little bit. So keep in mind, we have two different sets of user accounts. We have the benandbrady.com Active Directory user accounts, and then we have the SRV11 user accounts. This is the local system. Okay, this means that if I open up this SRV11 right now, what I'm looking at here are the local users and groups that are on SRV11. Because keep in mind, server 11 is a member server, it's not a domain controller. Okay, so a little bit confusing, but just to reiterate, we're assigning permissions to a folder on server 11, and we're going to be using local users and groups. Okay, and we're going to talk about how this works, in conjunction with Active Directory. But this is the recommended way of assigning permissions in a Windows 2000 domain environment. Okay, the domain administrators group is actually locally inside this local administrators group right here. Okay, so this is our local administrators group on SRV11. We're going to add that in, and if we were actually able to open this up, let's go take a look here in a second. If we could open this up, you would see that the domain admins from benandbrady.com's domain is in here. Okay, so that's how we give the administrators access to this particular server. So we're going to add that group. We're also going to add the local authenticated users. Okay, and an authenticated user is important to distinguish as well. I find that a lot of people are confused between the difference between authenticated users, and the everyone group. Make sure that you understand what the differences are. The everyone group is everybody. You don't have to have a user account. You could be a user on the internet, anonymous user, anything. It's anybody. All right? The authenticated users, these indicate any person that has an entry within the, in this case, local user database here. Okay, so if you don't have a user account here, then you're not an authenticated user. Now, this is different than a normal user group, though, because authenticated users mean everybody who's a user in the group. So that means that there could be an administrator, it could be a power user, a server operator, okay, depending upon where you're logging on. It's everybody who has a user account and a valid password is considered an authenticated user. Okay, and that last group I mentioned, just the plain old users, that's the users group. That's kind of the low-level group that you use for the majority of your users. Okay, so we're going to be fine using authenticated users in this case, and we will use that group. So we added that group. Lost our administrators in the meantime, though, so we're going to go back down here and re-add the administrators. So now we have two different groups, authenticated users and then the SRV11 administrators. Okay, click OK. And the permissions we're going to assign for administrators are going to be full control. Okay, I'm going to allow them to do everything. Authenticated users, though, we don't want to have full control. Instead of having full control, we're going to accept these defaults here, which are read and execute, list, and read. These permissions will allow the user to see the folder and click through it without writing information to it, without modifying it or deleting it, and without full control, which will allow them to change permissions or even take ownership of the folder. Okay, so we're going to click these three, which were there by default, so you don't really need to click them. Then we're going to remove the everyone group. Okay, so we've covered the majority of our users with authenticated users now. We're going to make our system more secure and get rid of this everyone group. So I select it. I'm going to click remove to show you this error message that pops up. Okay, it says you cannot remove everyone because this object is inheriting permissions from its parent. To remove everyone, you must prevent this object from inheriting permissions. Turn off the option for inheriting permissions and try removing everyone again. Okay, don't forget, in Windows 2000, permissions are inherited from the parent folder. So the D drive, the data drive, actually has everyone set at full control, and that's where the permission is initially set. So if we want to modify this setting, we're going to have to come down here and uncheck this box. When we uncheck this box, this is kind of an intimidating message here, but it really is fairly simple. It's asking us, in sum, do you want to keep this inherited permission and start modifying from there, or do you want to remove it entirely and just start modifying from there? Okay, so in a nutshell, do you want us to remove this for you? If you click remove, we'll remove it and you can modify this, access control list any way you want. Or do you want us to copy it to your access control list? Okay, when you have one entry like this, one access control entry, it's not a big deal. Okay, it's just one entry. But if you had, let's say, 10 different entries here, and you automatically lost them every time, it'd be a real pain to have to put these entries back on again. So if you clicked on copy, that would keep all 10 entries and then allow you to modify the permissions from the inherited permissions. Okay, so we're going to click remove because that's ultimately what we want to happen. And when I click remove, it's going to get rid of just this everyone group. Okay, so now that's gone, and let's double check, make sure we still have the permissions that we wanted. Authenticated users, administrators. Okay, so we click OK here, and now our permissions are set. That was done for the public folder. And before we move on forward to the software folder, let's take a look at what this did, what the effect was on these 4 folders here. If I open up the accounting folder, go to properties, and the security tab looking at NTFS permissions, notice what we have here. Trickling down to each of these folders now are the permissions from the parent folder. And that's what you see right here, allow inheritable permissions from parent to propagate to this object. So I have administrators with full control automatically set, and authenticated users with our 3 permissions, read and execute, list folder contents, and read. Okay, so that's going to be the same for each one of these folders. We'll open up another one here just to prove it. Okay, so in general, when you're setting permissions, it's always better to set permissions from the top and work your way down. The reason for that is you can set very general permissions up top. So notice that I just set those on the public folder. Now those trickle down, and those are inherited by these 4 folders. So now I don't have to go through the work 4 times over and assign those exact same permissions to these folders. If there happen to be subfolders underneath each one of these, let's say there were 7 more folders here that I wanted to have the exact same permissions on, well, those permissions are automatically inherited, so you don't have to do anything with them. The good news is too, just to give you an example here, and we won't leave this, so we'll erase this when we're done showing this off, is it doesn't have to be exact, meaning these permissions are inherited. If I want, we'll just pick something out here. Let's pick out dial-up. I can add additional groups, okay, or additional users. So it's not saying this is set in stone and that only these 2 groups can be used. It just means that these 2 particular groups are inherited, and now you're free to modify the rest any way you'd like. Okay, so we're going to remove that here. And then we're going to go back up to the software folder. Now in the software folder, we're going to be doing the exact same thing we just did. Okay, the goal is the same. Assign those same permissions. So we're going to get rid of the everyone group eventually. But first, we're going to add authenticated users. Just make sure we switch this. This is important. Look in, and it's telling you, do you want to look into the domain database or do you want to look into the local database? Now, authenticated users is not a big deal because we've got the same group in both of these. But the administrators, the local administrators group, we'll find in the SRv11 system. So it's important that we choose administrators from SRv11. Okay, so I held down Control, I clicked administrators, and I got both of these groups now. So we have authenticated users, and we have Server 11 administrators. I click OK. Let's set our permissions. Administrators get full control. Authenticated users get the default permissions, okay, which will allow them to read the folder, open it up, so on and so forth. Okay, now, one additional thing we're going to be doing here, though, we'll wait till we get there. We need to remove the everyone group first. So once again, when I click remove, we get this error message telling us that we cannot do that. This permission is being inherited. So I click OK. I'm going to uncheck this box. And just to differentiate between what these do, I'm going to click copy here now and show you how this works. When I click copy, the group actually stays. Remember before when I selected remove, this one disappeared? Well, now I can manually remove it. Okay, so that checkbox was unchecked by that command. Okay, so then I click OK, and then we're back up to our desktop here. Alright, it's time to get more specific with our permission settings right now. So we're going to go over to the public folder. And inside the public folder, what we're going to work on first is each one of these individual folders. So we'll start out with accounting. We'll talk about how we need to secure this particular folder. So if I go to the NTFS permissions for this folder, we'll see that we have the default permissions that trickle down. And notice here we have the checkbox indicating that these permissions have been inherited from the parent. And also notice these are grayed out. Okay, right now I can't select any of these. Nothing happens when I try to select them. Same thing here. These permissions have been inherited from the parent folder. Now what we want to do though is take a look at this and analyze who we actually want to be able to access this folder. And remember, this is the accounting folder. And rules that we set forth ahead of time when we talk to the network manager where the administrator should have full control. And if we look here, that's the case. But what we want to do is actually remove authenticated users and use the group accounting. Okay, so to remove authenticated users, I can't just remove them. Okay, you get the error message that you see here. To do that, I'm going to have to uncheck this box. And now I have the choice of copying these permissions, which basically means keep what you have going forward, or remove. Okay, remove what you have and just start from scratch. We're going to copy, keep what we have. That leaves us with our administrators at full control, which we want to keep, and an authenticated users. Now we're going to lose this because we do want to get rid of authenticated users. So we remove, and now it's time to go add the accounting group. Okay, and you should have, recall, we created these ahead of time, but there should be an accounting group within the benandbrady.com domain. So if you go search right now, you should find accounting. Okay, so you're going to select that group, click add, then click OK. The next confusing portion is what we actually, or how we're going to actually assign these permissions. Keep in mind what we want to do. These users who open up the accounting folder are going to be accounting users. So they should have the ability to open this folder up, and they should also have the ability to create, delete, and modify their own information within this folder. The problem we have here, though, is using our default permissions. For example, right now these permissions are not enough to give the accounting users the ability to create their own files, folders, etc. within inside the accounting folder. If I click Write, Write will allow these users to open up accounting and create folders and files, but it will not allow them to modify those folders or files. But if I click Modify, now we're giving them the ability to rename this folder or delete it altogether. So we're giving them too many permissions. So this is where it gets confusing, like I said, and the only way to properly assign these permissions are to use what are called special permissions. So we're going to take away these permissions here and just start with what we had, and then click on the Advanced button. Now once we go here, this is just another way of representing the entries that you saw on the previous screen. Okay, so here you see these entries. These are the default permissions that we can use. When we click Advanced now, we see our permission entries, and we're going to choose the accounting entry because this is the one that we're modifying, and we're going to click on View Edit. Now these permissions are actually all the special permissions that make up the default permissions. Okay, what I mean by this, these permissions right here, read and execute, list folder contents, and read, these three permissions actually consist of these 5 different permissions. Okay, so these 5 permissions here make up those regular permissions. If I were to change this, let me just give you an example here. Let's say that I remove read and read and execute and just leave list. If we go back and look at these special permissions once again, okay, you see you have these now for just folders and subfolders, and you have a different permission here for just folders. Okay, so it's a little bit different. It's not a real clear example, but what I'm trying to tell you is the permissions that you assign here actually make up those permissions you see on the initial screen. So let's go back to where we were before. Give our accounting users back their default permissions. Okay, we'll clarify this as we go along too. So we're going to go back into the advanced screen. We're going to look at the accounting group, special permissions. Now what we need to do here is allow them the ability to once again create files and create folders within the accounting folder without modifying the actual accounting folder itself. Okay, and to do that, we can start clicking these permissions. So these 4 are already selected, that's great. We'd like to allow them to create files and write data, create folders and append data. Now we have a couple different choices here, write attributes and write extended attributes. You could allow users to do this, but it's really not something that a normal user needs to be able to do. It's in regards to making a file a read-only file or a hidden file, or using encrypting file system or compression. So we're going to leave these 2 unchecked as well. Then these 2 here are the big ones that we need to worry about. Delete subfolders and files, and delete. Now delete subfolders and files we do want to allow, because this now will allow users to modify, move, or just flat out delete their folders and files within the accounting folder. And that's okay. You know, it sounds like you're giving them too much permission, but they have to have some flexibility to be able to work. You know, you have to be able to move or rename a folder or a file. Okay, so in this case here, you're going to select this. This next permission though, delete, this would be referring to the actual folder itself. And this is the one that makes up our modify permission. If I select this, this is going to allow any user then to, or any accounting user then, to delete this folder. So this is the key one right here that we want to make sure that we do not select. And our last two permissions down here, change permissions and then take ownership. These two are really only necessary for an administrator, and you get these two permissions by specifying full control. Okay, so these permissions here we selected are what we want to go with. Click OK. Click OK a second time. And when I look here now, notice what this says here. We have these three permissions, but it also says additional permissions are present but not viewable here. Press advanced to see them. So make sure you pay attention to this. This can catch you off guard. So there's actually permissions in addition to what you see here. And the same thing can happen. Sometimes you will see none of these boxes selected and you'll think that no permissions are set for a particular user. That's not the case. If you went to the additional permissions, you'd see that they did indeed have permissions set. Okay, so we're all done with this. We're going to click OK. And we're going to move forward to the marketing folder now. And we're going to do the exact same thing. Okay, so we go to security. The administrator's permissions are fine, but we want to remove authenticated users and add the marketing group. To do that, though, we have to uncheck this box. We're going to click copy, which will keep both of these access control entries. This one's going to stay. Authenticated users we're going to lose, though. So we click remove. Now we're going to click add. And we're going to add the marketing group, which is down here at the bottom. Click OK again. And now we have administrators and marketing. These permissions are not enough though. If we left these permissions here, the marketing users would log on, they'd be able to open up the folder, but they would not be able to create any new information or modify any existing information. So we have to go to the advanced button, then we select this entry, click on view edit, and this is where we're going to specify additional permissions. Okay, they can create files within that folder. They can create folders within the marketing folder. They can't write attributes, so we're going to leave those alone. They can delete subfolders and files within the marketing folder. They cannot delete the marketing folder itself though. So this is the key one we were talking about before that you want to make sure that you do not check. And they do not have the ability to change permissions or take ownership of the marketing folder. Okay, so we click OK, OK again, OK a third time. It's important that you click OK all the way out. And those permissions have now been set. Last one, we're going to go over to the sales folder, security, and we're going to do the exact same thing. Okay. Remove authenticated users, add sales, okay, these aren't enough, so we give them their special permissions. Select sales, view edit, create files, create folders, delete subfolders and files, and that's it. Click OK all the way out. Very important. If you hit any one of these X's, you're basically canceling without saving any changes. Okay. Remember, additional permissions are present, but you can't see them. Okay, we're all set there. Last one we're going to take a look at is our general folder. Now in the general folder, a little bit different. Okay, remember we want anybody within our organization to be able to open up this general folder, share and collaborate information and data. What we don't want to happen though is the same thing we were discussing before. Nobody should be able to modify this folder or delete it. So how are we going to address this issue? Just a little bit different. In this circumstance, what we want to do, we have administrators full control and we have the authenticated users group, okay, which is fine. Now we could select this box here and basically uninherit the permissions from the parent. It's probably not necessary in this case though. Okay, Okay, for example, I can click on Advanced, open up Authenticated Users, and now I can start specifying additional permissions here. Okay, because if you look, none of these permissions that we want to select or deselect are even affected by this propagation from the parent. So let me clarify what I'm trying to explain to you here. Authenticated users have to be able to open up this general folder without modifying it or deleting it. To do that, we're going to go to the special permissions, just like we've done in the 3 previous examples. So any authenticated user. And an authenticated user now, don't forget, that's any user account that's logged on with a valid password. So that could be a member of marketing, a member of sales, a member of accounting, or even a user account that's not a member of any of those groups. The only prerequisite is the user account is present either in Active Directory or on this local system and has a valid password. Okay, so what do we want them to do? Create files, create folders, delete subfolders and files, but not delete the folder itself. Click OK, click OK again, click OK a third time, and we should be all set on our public folder. Okay, before we move forward though and test this out, we're going to go over and take a look at our software folder. And pretty much the same thing, just slightly different. The big difference here is with the administrative folder here, users have absolutely no access whatsoever. This is an administrative share here. We don't want normal users to be able to access this. So we're going to go to the Security tab, and we're going to flat out remove the authenticated users. To do that though, I'm going to have to uncheck this box to allow inheritable permissions from parent to propagate to this object. We'll copy, meaning we'll keep what was here. Then we just select authenticated users and click on remove. Okay, and let's talk about something here. A lot of times people get confused between an entry not being here and the deny permission, thinking that maybe with authenticated users we'd have to use deny. It's not the case. If an access control entry does not exist, meaning if there's not a group or a user account that you're part of mentioned here, you can't access this particular folder. Okay, so right now the only group you see is the administrators group. So if you're a user who logs on and you're part of the administrators group, you have access to this folder. If you're not part of the administrators group, you do not. It's that simple because there's no entry there. Deny is used when you want to override maybe a portion of a access control entry. For example, maybe here in my administrators group I've got a couple junior level admins who I don't want to have access to some of the information here for whatever reason. What you can do is add that particular user account. So for example, maybe it's Sam, and I don't have a user account here, so we'll just pull out one. We'll say Sue Stevens. She's a junior level admin, and for the most part she should be part of the administrators group because we use this group over and over and over again, and she can access 95% of anything the administrators access, she can access. But in this particular case, Sue Stevens should not be able to access this folder. Well, now it's a good candidate for a deny. If I don't want her to be able to access something, I use the deny permission, which is denying her full control. So this allows me to give administrators in general full control permissions to this folder, but then pick out a particular user or a series of users and deny them access to the folder. Okay, and a deny always overrides an allow. So in this case here, Sue Stevens' account is here, and she's also part of this group. Well, this is going to override the fact that she has a deny here, is going to override any full control that she had here. Okay, so we're going to remove that entry. We don't want to leave that one there. Leave administrators, full control, click OK, and then go on to users. Now remember, this users folder is available to any of the users to open up and actually access. So this one I'm going to be doing a little bit differently, fairly similar to what we saw before. Okay, administrators have full control. Authenticated users in this case, we're not going to give them the ability to create their own software, to post their own software, or modify what we have. The only thing we want them to be able to do is copy information, which is the equivalent to reading information down from our folder, our software share here, down to their computers. So the default permissions we have here are fine. So we can accept those. Authenticated users read and execute list and read, and administrators full control. So I click OK here, close this out, and we can move on to our next step. Okay, let's actually go back up and open this folder back again. And I jumped the gun a little bit before when I assigned these shares right here. Typically, you want to make sure that your NTFS permissions are intact and created, assigned. Because if you assign these shares ahead of time and then you don't assign NTFS permissions right away, you're giving users the ability to connect to your information right away. So it could be a security risk. In our case here, we had empty folder structure, so it wasn't really a big deal. What we want to take a look at, though, is what we can do when we share these folders. So we're going to go back into the Sharing tab, and you can get there a couple different ways. When you click on Sharing, it takes you into the properties of this public folder. You see that we have these 4 tabs, and the Sharing tab is highlighted. It's the equivalent of going to Properties and just selecting the Sharing tab. Don't be misled by that. Some people confuse that and don't really know the difference. So it's the exact same thing. Now, the default share name is going to be the same name of the folder, and if you can get away with it, keep it. No reason to make it more difficult than it has to be. If you want to add a comment, you can add a comment. This will be available to the users when they're looking at the folder shares in a detailed view. User limit can be used to control the number of users who are allowed to connect to this share. Probably the best reason to use this, maybe you have some sort of software license that only allows a certain number of users to access something at any one given time. Well, you can control that with this mechanism here. For the most part, though, maximum allowed will be the selection that you'll leave selected. Last thing we'll talk about here are the permissions. Okay, and hopefully you have a little bit of background on share permissions and NTFS permissions. But share permissions have been around for a while, and they're the only permissions that are available with FAT or FAT32 file systems. Okay, so if you format your partition, let's say we didn't use NTFS for some reason, we were dual booting with Windows 95, you would only have the ability to use share permissions. The security tab where you assign NTFS permissions would not even be available. Okay, so share permissions can be used. They only apply over the network. So if I assign share permissions, somebody can log onto my system locally and access anything they want, because share permissions do not prevent users from accessing resources locally. Keep that in mind as well. And in general, in a production environment, we have everything formatted NTFS or on a system that is formatted with NTFS. You don't really need to use share permissions. Okay, so for example, right now I've got everyone set at full control, and it looks like a glaring security hole right here, but it's really not an issue, provided that you lock down the rest of your resources using NTFS permissions. Okay, so what I'm trying to tell you is share permissions and NTFS permissions combine together to give you the ultimate security on that particular resource. Okay, and they're going to take the most restrictive between the two. So for example, here I'm assigning everyone full control. If I close this and look at security, here we're only allowing administrators full control and authenticated users read and execute, list and read. Okay, well, the most restrictive permission is what you see right here. So an administrator will indeed have full control, and authenticated users are going to have these 3 permissions we just discussed. Okay, so the net effect here is share permissions will never affect you provided that you use NTFS permissions. Okay, and I recommend make sure you set up your NTFS permissions correctly from the beginning and avoid using share permissions. Because when you start trying to manipulate and modify share permissions, it becomes way more confusing. Okay, it becomes a lot more difficult to calculate the cumulative permissions. And don't mistake this. It's not making your system any more secure when you use share permissions. Okay, sometimes people think that because you're adding an extra layer of permissions that it's more secure now. It's not the case. You're just convoluting and complicating the actual permission assignment. Okay, so long story short there, avoid using share permissions on NTFS partitions provided that you're very meticulous about assigning those NTFS permissions. Okay, so we'll click OK there, and you would do the exact same thing in the software folder. Okay, you'd have to share it by clicking Share this folder. You can actually specify a different share name, but the name of the folder will be the default name. Maximum allowed permission should remain at everyone full control, and then you'll be all set. Okay, the next thing we're going to do is step off of SRv11, and we're going to go test this out. So we're going to actually disconnect, and now we're sitting back on client 1. And what we're going to do is use the user account Jill Smith And Jill Smith was created in our lab setup along with several other users. So if you didn't do that, it's time to go back to the lab setup video, or at least the lab setup manual, and make sure that you create your users in the groups. Otherwise this lab's not going to work properly. Now Jill Smith works in the accounting department, and she's in turn part of the accounting group within Windows 2000. So before we get started, what we're going to simulate here is we're sitting on a Windows 2000 Pro system, and we're going to log off and we're going to log on and basically pretend like we're Jill Smith. We want to take a look at what we can access and what we can't access. This is something as an administrator you should be going through anytime you've assigned permissions. You want to make sure that everything you've set is working properly. Okay, so I'm going to stop the video here momentarily, log off, and then log back on, and we'll start right back up. Okay, we've logged back on here as Jill Smith. Now what we're going to do is go out and test these file shares. Let's go out and see if we can access the information that we should be able to access, and see if we can't access the information that we shouldn't be able to. So in this case here, what we're going to do is just browse out to SRV1 by opening up My Network Places. Then we're going to select Entire Network, Entire Contents of the Network, Microsoft Windows Network, and then we're going to select the Ben and Brady domain. Now you should see these three systems just like I do here. Client 1, SRV1, and SRV11. SRV11 is where we created our different folders and shared out the information. So I'm going to go ahead and open up SRV11. Here we see our two different shares, public and software. We'll open up public. Okay, now let's take a look at our different folders that we have here. Remember, Jill Smith is part of accounting, so she should be able to open up the accounting folder. We're going to start over here with marketing. Okay, and we see that access is denied, and this is what we want. Jill Smith is not a member of the marketing group, so she should not be able to open this folder up at all. Same thing with sales. Same thing, access is denied. So that's a good thing. What about the general folder? Yes, remember everybody should be able to open up the general folder. So Jill Smith should be able to open it up. She can. And she should also be able to modify information in here. Okay, so here's where you start testing stuff out. Can Jill Smith actually create a folder within this particular folder? Okay, if she can do this, and she can, that's considered being able to write to this folder. So she has the write permission. Let's see if she has the delete permission. She does. Okay, she was able to delete that. So what we have here then is the ability to create a folder, delete a folder, recreate a folder, and let's see if we can rename. Shouldn't be any reason why we wouldn't be able to based upon what we've seen already, but just for the heck of it, let's just name it Jill S. No problem. Okay, so this one's all working. No problems with this so far. Let's check our accounting folder. Jill Smith's part of the accounting department, so she should be able to access this folder as well. She can. Okay, good. Now we're going to create a folder in here, and we're going to do the exact same test here. Okay. We're going to create the taxes folder. We can create it without a problem. That's good. Let's see if we can delete. Yes, no problem. We'll create that folder once again. Intentionally misspell it. And let's see that we can rename it now. Okay, no problem. So by showing this, what this is showing us is that Jill Smith has the ability to create a folder, delete a folder, recreate the folder, modify the folder. She can do anything she wants inside this particular accounting folder, and that's the way we had it set up. That's what we wanted to happen. Now, one more test we need to do is what Jill Smith can do at this level. Okay, remember, this is the area that we set up as the administrator, and we don't want anybody to be able to modify this particular area. For example, what if Jill Smith came along here and she decided that she didn't feel like going inside the Jill Smith area, okay, and she wanted to create her own folder? As you just saw there, access was denied. Okay, so she's logged on right now. She's trying to create her own folder here, but she's not able to. Okay, the next test. Can she delete this folder? Because she should only be able to delete information inside this area. She should not be able to delete this whole folder. Okay. Access was denied once again, so she couldn't do that. Can she rename it? Okay, cannot rename accounting. Access is denied. So that's working out good so far. Let's see if she can delete the general folder. Okay, once again, she cannot do that, and we'll try renaming it. She can't do that as well. So this is the type of testing that you need to do. You need to go through and make sure that, when you set up these permissions, they're working exactly how you think they're going to work. And believe me, permissions are more complex than people give them credit for. A lot of times I've seen administrators assign permissions and think they have it working perfectly, and then users go in and can access information they shouldn't be able to, or they're able to delete information they shouldn't be able to, even worse. Okay, let's go back one step here, and let's test out our software folder. So we can open it up. Can Jill Smith open up the admin folder? She cannot. Okay, that's good. Can she open up the users folder? Yes, she can. Now, we didn't put any software in here, so it's not a real good test here, but normally, you would populate this folder with whatever software you wanted the users to have access to. Okay, so Jill should only be able to read information within this folder and, copy it over to her computer. She should not be able to create a new folder and add her own information. Okay, and as you can see, she's not able to create a folder. Try even a file. See if she can add a file here. No. Okay, can't do that as well. So far, it's looking pretty good. Okay, so what you're going to want to do now, we've gone through one user account. I want you to go back, take some time, and test out each of the different user accounts. In the lab setup, in addition to Jill Smith, we created 3 other user accounts, and you also have the administrator user account. You should go through, log off the Windows 2000 Pro system here, and log back on as each individual user account, and test it out. See what you can and can't access. Okay, that's very important that you test each one of them out. This will give you a real good feel for how to set up these permissions, how they should work. Okay, that wraps up Lab 1. We'll see you back here real soon for Lab 2.